I always wanted to be a park ranger for as long as I can remember. Being out in nature, hiking, camping and fishing, that was pretty much all I wanted to do as a kid. It took a while and I worked a lot of shitty odd jobs, but eventually I was hired full-time by the Forestry Service as a fire lookout. The helicopter dropped me off at the tower on a Tuesday morning in late June. The pilot helped me unload my gear, 2 duffel bags, a cooler full of food, and a box of emergency supplies. The tower stood about 60 feet tall, all metal framework and wooden platforms with a small cabin at the top that would be my home for the next 8 weeks. Robert Mitchell, my supervisor, climbed down from the observation deck as we finished unloading. He was a stocky guy in his 50s with greying hair and wire-rimmed glasses, wearing the standard Forestry Service uniform. "Morrison, right?" he said, shaking my hand. "Welcome to Tower 7, thanks. This place is pretty remote. That's the point. You'll have radio contact with dispatch, but otherwise you're on your own out here." He glanced at his watch. "Let me show you the setup before we head." Back we climbed the metal ladder to the observation deck. The cabin was small but functional. Radio equipment, weather monitoring gear, a narrow bed, and a tiny kitchen area. Windows on all 4 sides gave me a 360 view of the forest stretching to the horizon. "Radio check is every morning at 800 hours, Robert said, pointing to the equipment. "Weather report at noon and 6 p.m. If you spot smoke, call it in immediately with coordinates." "Got it." He pulled a folded piece of paper from his shirt pocket. Previous lookouts left some notes. Might be helpful. I took the paper and unfolded it. Someone had written 6 rules in blue ink. 1. Clean any blood you find in the tower immediately. Don't wait. 2. Don't leave the tower after dark for any reason. 3. If the radio goes completely silent during a storm, evacuate to the maintenance cabin until you hear static again. 4. During clear weather, if you hear thunder, stay away from all windows until it stops. 5. Report any fires you see, but don't investigate flames that appear at night. 6. If you see a person in the forest, don't make contact. Stay in the tower. I read through the list twice, then looked up at Robert. "Is this serious?" "Previous lookouts wrote those. Take them however you want." He checked his watch again. "We need to get going. Helicopters burning fuel." "What about the blood thing? That's got to be a joke, right?" Robert shrugged. "Like I said, take it however you want. You've got my radio frequency if you need anything." We climbed back down and Robert grabbed his gear bag from where he'd left it by the helicopter. The pilot was already running through his pre-flight checks. 8 weeks, Robert said over the rotor noise. "Dispatcher Chen will be your main contact. She's good people." They lifted off 5 minutes later, leaving me alone with the sound of wind through the trees. I watched the helicopter disappear over the ridge, then looked around at my new home. The forest stretched in every direction, thick stands of pine and fir, broken up by rocky outcroppings and small clearings. No roads, no buildings, no people for miles. I carried my gear up to the cabin and spent the rest of the day getting settled. The radio worked fine. I checked in with Grace Kim, the dispatcher, and she walked me through the daily routine. The weather equipment was straightforward, and the view from the observation deck was incredible. That night I made dinner on the small propane stove and read through the orientation manual Robert had left. Standard fire lookout procedures, emergency protocols, wildlife safety. Nothing about blood or mysterious thunder or people in the forest. I pulled out the handwritten rules again and read them over. The blood thing was obviously maybe someone had cut themselves, and the previous lookout was just being dramatic about cleaning up. The other rules seemed like either safety protocols or inside jokes. Don't leave after dark. Probably good advice in bear country. Stay away from windows during thunder. Maybe the tower attracted lightning. Don't investigate. Night fires. Could be dangerous terrain. I folded the paper and stuck it in the manual. Jokes or not, I figured I'd probably follow most of them anyway. Better safe than sorry in a place this remote. The first 2 days went by without any problems. I did my radio checks, monitored the weather, and spent most of my time reading or watching the forest through binoculars. No fires, no emergencies, no weird... just me and about 1,000,000 acres of wilderness. On Thursday morning, I was making coffee when I noticed dark stains on the floor near the radio equipment. They looked like someone had spilled something and hadn't cleaned it up properly. The stains were roughly circular, about the size of dinner plates, and they'd soaked into the wood. I knelt down and touched one of the spots. It felt sticky, and when I brought my finger close to my nose, it had a metallic smell like old pennies. "What the hell?" I muttered. The stains definitely looked like blood. Old blood that had dried and darkened. But how the hell had blood gotten on the floor? I'd been here 3 days and hadn't cut myself or seen any injuries. Maybe the previous lookout had an accident before leaving. I remembered the first rule on the handwritten list. Clean any blood you find in the tower immediately. Don't. Wait, yeah, right, I said out loud. Some previous lookout's idea of a joke. I went back to making coffee and tried to ignore the stains, but every time I walked past the radio area, I noticed them. They seemed bigger somehow or darker, probably just my imagination. Around noon, I was doing my weather report when I started feeling like someone was watching me. It was subtle at first, just that prickly sensation you get when you think someone's staring at you. I looked out the windows but didn't see anything except trees. The feeling got stronger as the afternoon went on. By 3, I was checking the windows every few minutes, scanning the forest with binoculars. Nothing. Just endless trees and shadows. But the sensation wouldn't go away. It felt like eyes on me, studying me, waiting for something. I tried to focus on other things. Reading, organizing my gear, checking equipment, but I kept glancing toward the windows. The bloodstains seemed more noticeable too. Every time I walked past them, they caught my eye. Dark spots on the wooden floor that definitely hadn't been there when I arrived. By 6 p.m., the watching sensation was so strong I could barely concentrate on my evening radio check. Grace's voice crackled through the speaker, asking for my weather report, and I had to force myself to focus on the instruments. "'Twere 7, you sound distracted tonight," she said, after I finished reading the numbers. "Just tired, long day, copy that, get some rest, check in tomorrow at 0800, will do." I signed off and looked around the cabin. The bloodstains seemed to have gotten darker while I was on the radio, and the watching sensation was stronger than ever, like something was pressed against the windows, staring in at me. I grabbed the cleaning supplies from under the small sink: bleach, scrub brush, paper towels. The handwritten rules were probably, but cleaning up old bloodstains was just basic hygiene. Anyway, I knelt down next to the first stain and poured bleach directly onto it. The liquid foamed and bubbled, and the metallic smell got stronger. I scrubbed hard with the brush, working the bleach into the wood grain. The stain came up easier than I expected. Within a few minutes of scrubbing, the dark spot had faded to almost nothing. I moved to the second stain and repeated the process, then the third. As I worked, the watching sensation started to fade. By the time I finished cleaning the last stain, it was completely gone. The oppressive feeling of being observed just vanished, like someone had flipped a switch. I sat back on my heels and looked around the cabin. The floor was clean. The metallic smell was gone, and I felt normal again. No more prickly sensation. No more feeling of eyes on me. The moment I finished scrubbing the last trace of the stains away, the forest outside seemed to settle back into its normal, quiet rhythm. I'd been at Tower 7 for 3 days when I decided the second rule was complete garbage. Don't leave the tower after dark. What kind of nonsense was that? I was a grown man, not some kid afraid of the boogeyman. The Forest Service had hired me to watch for fires and if I needed to check something outside after sunset. I was damn well going to do it. Thursday evening, I made my 6th weather report to Grace and settled in with a can of chili for dinner. The sun was dropping behind the tree line, painting everything orange and red. I'd been thinking about taking a walk around the base of the tower once it got dark, maybe stretch my legs and get some fresh air. The cabin felt cramped after being cooped up all day. Around 8:30, just as the last light faded, I heard something that made me stop mid-bite. A voice calling from somewhere in the trees below. I set down my spoon and listened. There it was again. Definitely human, definitely calling something. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like someone shouting a name. Maybe a hiker who'd gotten turned around in the dark. I grabbed my flashlight and headed for the ladder. If someone was lost out there, I should help them. That was just common sense. Rules are no rules. But as I reached for the ladder, the voice came again closer this time, and something about it made me freeze. Alexander, clear as day. My name. Someone was calling my name from the forest below. I moved to the window and peered down, but the darkness was too thick to see anything. My flashlight beam couldn't reach far enough to penetrate the trees. The voice came again from a different direction this time. Alexander. Same tone, same cadence, like someone reading my name off a list. I stood there for maybe 10 minutes listening. The voice moved through the trees, sometimes to the left of the tower, sometimes to the right, always calling my name in that flat, emotionless way, never getting closer than maybe 50 yards, never moving farther than 100. My first thought was that someone from the Forestry Service was messing with me, some kind of hazing ritual for the new guy. But who would hike out here in the dark just to play a prank? And how did they know my name? The calling continued for another hour. I tried shouting back a few times. Who's there? And do you need help? But got no response. Just that same monotone voice drifting through the trees, saying my name over and over. Around 10:00 it stopped. The forest went quiet, except for the usual night sounds. Owls, insects, the wind in the branches. I waited another 30 minutes, but the voice didn't return. I didn't go outside that night. Friday evening, it happened again. Same time, same pattern. The voice started calling around 8:30 and continued until 10. This time, I counted. My name was called 67 times from at least a dozen different locations around the tower. I tried using my binoculars, but they were useless in the dark. Saturday night, the voices multiplied. Not just one person calling my name, but 3 or 4, maybe more. They moved independently through the forest, creating an overlapping chorus that made my skin crawl. Sometimes they called in unison, sometimes they took turns. The sound echoed off the trees in a way that made it impossible to pinpoint exact locations. I radioed Grace during my Sunday morning check-in, trying to sound casual. Hey Grace, quick question. You guys have any other personnel working in this area? Maybe doing night patrols or something? Negative, Alexander. You're the only one assigned to that sector. Why? Just thought I heard some voices last night. Probably hikers. Hikers don't usually camp in that area. Too remote. If you're hearing people, they might be lost. Want me to send someone to check it out? No, that's okay. Probably just my imagination. But it wasn't my imagination. Sunday night brought 5 or 6 voices, all calling my name from different parts of the forest. They seemed to be getting bolder, moving closer to the tower. A couple times I could swear I heard footsteps on the metal stairs below. But when I shined my flashlight down, nothing was there. By the end of my first week, I'd completely abandoned any thought of leaving the tower after dark. Whatever was out there in the forest, I didn't want to meet it face to face. Monday morning of my second week, I found blood on the windows. Not a lot, just a few drops on the glass, like someone had flicked a wet paintbrush. But it was definitely blood. Dark red, thick, with that same metallic smell I remembered from the floor stains. I cleaned it immediately, remembering what had happened when I'd ignored the blood before. The watching sensation, the oppressive feeling of being observed. I wasn't going through that again, but the blood kept coming back. Tuesday morning, more drops on the windows. Wednesday, I found smears on the radio equipment. Thursday brought streaks down the inside walls like someone had dragged bloody fingers across the wood. Every morning I'd wake up and find fresh blood somewhere in the tower. Sometimes just a few drops, sometimes larger stains. I got into a routine of checking every surface as soon as I got up, then cleaning whatever I found with bleach and paper towels. The worst part was that I never caught it happening. I'd clean everything before bed, and by morning there would be new blood. It appeared silently without any sign of how it got there. The tower was sealed tight, no gaps in the walls, no broken windows, no way for anything to get inside. During my second week, the voices got worse too. They started earlier each night and lasted longer. Sometimes they'd call my name for 4 or 5 hours straight, moving through the forest in patterns that seemed almost choreographed. I began to recognize individual voices. A woman's voice that always came from the north side. A man's voice that circled the tower clockwise. A child's voice that only called from directly below. The child's voice was the worst, high and clear, cutting through the darkness like a knife. It never moved from that spot directly beneath the tower. Just called my name over and over from the same location. I stopped looking out the windows at night. Whatever was down there, I didn't want to see it. By Friday of my second week, I was finding blood every day in new locations. On the latter, rungs smeared across my sleeping bag, dripping from the ceiling onto my food supplies. I went through 3 bottles of bleach that week, scrubbing and cleaning constantly. The blood never appeared during the day, only at night, while I slept. I tried staying awake to catch it happening, but exhaustion always won. I'd doze off for an hour or 2, and when I woke up, there would be fresh blood somewhere new. Saturday night, I found bloody handprints on the inside of the windows. Small hands like a child's. They were pressed against the glass from the inside, as if someone had been trying to get out rather than in. I cleaned them off with shaking hands, trying not to think about how they'd gotten there. The tower was 40 feet off the ground. There was no way for anyone to reach the windows from outside, and I was the only person inside. Sunday morning brought the worst discovery yet. I woke up to find blood covering the radio equipment, not just drops or smears, but pools of it soaking into the electronics. I spent 2 hours cleaning it off, terrified that the radio might be damaged. When I tried my morning check-in with Grace, the radio crackled with static for a few seconds before her voice came through. "Tower 7, this is dispatch. You're coming through weak this morning, Alexander. Everything okay up there?" "Yeah, just some equipment issues."
"Signal should be fine now. Copy that. Let me know if you have any more problems." I didn't tell her about the blood. How could I? She'd think I was losing my mind. Hell, maybe I was losing my mind. Normal people didn't find mysterious blood in
sealed towers. Normal people didn't hear voices calling their names from empty forests, but the rules had been right about everything so far. Clean the blood immediately. And when I did, things stayed manageable. Don't leave the tower after dark. And I'd learned that lesson without having to test it. Maybe the previous lookouts hadn't been playing pranks. Maybe they'd been trying to help. I pulled out the folded paper with the 6 rules and read them again. The handwriting looked different now. Not like jokes, but like warnings, instructions written by someone who'd been through exactly what I was experiencing. Someone who'd survived long enough to pass on what they'd learned. The blood kept appearing throughout my stay. Sometimes in small amounts, sometimes covering entire surfaces. I never figured out where it came from or how it got into the tower, but I cleaned it every time, following the first rule exactly. And somehow that seemed to keep whatever was happening from getting worse. I was settling into my 3rd week at Tower 7 when the weather turned nasty. Dark clouds had been building all morning, and by noon, the wind was howling through the trees below. I'd done my weather report to Grace right on schedule, noting the incoming storm system when the first lightning strike hit somewhere close enough to make the whole tower shake. The rain started coming down in sheets, hammering against the windows so hard I could barely see 20 FT into the forest. I was keeping an eye on the weather instruments when the radio suddenly went completely dead. Not just quiet, dead. No static, no background hum, nothing. The power indicator light was still on, but when I tried to raise Grace on the emergency frequency, I got absolute silence. I checked all the connections, tried different channels, even smacked the side of the radio a couple times. Nothing. The storm was getting worse, and I could hear thunder rolling constantly now, one crash after another. That's when I remembered. The 3rd rule from that handwritten list. If the radio goes silent during a storm, evacuate immediately and find shelter away from the tower. I'd been dismissing those rules as pranks for weeks, but after everything I'd experienced with the blood and the voices, I wasn't taking any chances. I grabbed my emergency pack from under the bed and stuffed it with water bottles, energy bars, my flashlight, and the first aid kit. The whole tower was swaying in the wind now, and I could hear metal creaking somewhere below. Getting down that
ladder in the storm was terrifying. The rain was coming at me sideways, and the metal rungs were slippery as hell.
I had to stop twice when lightning flashed close enough to make my hair stand up. By the time I reached the ground, I was soaked through and shivering. I remembered seeing a small building during my first day here, maybe a 4 mile through the big trees. It had looked like some kind of maintenance shed. I headed in that direction using my flashlight to navigate between the trees while branches whipped around in the wind. The rain was so loud I couldn't hear anything else. It took me 20
minutes to find the cabin, and I was starting to think I'd gotten turned around when I spotted the metal roof through the trees.
The door was unlocked and I stumbled inside, dripping water all over the floor. The place was bigger than I'd expected. 1 room with a workbench, some tools, and what looked like backup equipment mounted on the far wall. I dried off with some old rags I found and checked out the equipment. Sure enough, there was a radio set up, older than the one in the tower, but functional. I tried to raise Grace on the emergency frequency, but the storm was interfering with everything. All I got was static and broken transmission, so I waited. The cabin had no windows, which was probably for the best, given what I'd learned about looking outside during weird weather. I could hear the storm raging overhead, thunder crashing every few seconds, and the rain pounding on the metal roof like machine gun fire. Every so often, the whole building would shake when lightning struck. Nearby, I ate one of my energy bars and checked my watch. 2 in the afternoon. The storm had been going for about an hour when the radio died. I tried the backup radio every 30 minutes, but kept getting the same static and interference. The storm showed no signs of letting up. Around 4, I started hearing something else mixed in with the thunder. It sounded almost like voices, but that could have been the wind playing tricks. I stayed put in the center of the cabin away from the door and tried not to think about what might be out there in the storm. The hours crawled by. I dozed off a couple times only to wake up when particularly loud thunder shook the building. My watch said 6:30 when I tried the radio again and got the same static. Grace would be expecting my evening weather report, but there was no way to reach her. It was almost 8 when I heard it. A faint crackling from the backup radio. I turned up the volume and heard what sounded like Grace's voice, broken up and distant, but definitely her. I grabbed the microphone and tried to respond, but the signal faded before I could make contact. I waited another hour, trying the radio every few minutes. Finally, around 9, I got a clear signal. Grace's voice came through asking for any stations in the area to respond. I keyed the microphone and identified myself, explaining that I'd lost radio contact during the storm and had evacuated to a backup location. She sounded relieved to hear from me and confirmed that the storm had knocked out communications across the whole region. Emergency crews were dealing with downed power lines and flooding, but the worst of it had passed. She told me to stay put until morning unless I felt it was safe to return to the tower. I tried the tower radio frequency and got static, which meant the system was working again, even if the signal was weak. The storm was definitely moving off. I could hear the thunder getting more distant, and the rain had dropped to a steady patter of the earlier downpour. I packed up my gear and stepped outside. The air smelled clean and fresh, and I could see stars starting to appear between the breaking clouds. The walk back to the tower was easier without the wind and driving rain, though I had to navigate around a couple fallen branches. The tower looked intact when I reached it, and the climb up was much easier than the trip down had been. Inside the cabin, everything was exactly as I'd left it. I tried the radio and got Grace immediately. Clear signal? No problems. She confirmed that I was back online and told me to get some rest. That was my first real test of the rules, and following them had probably saved my life. A 60-ft metal tower in a lightning storm wasn't exactly the safest place to be. The 4th week started quietly enough. I'd settled back into my routine of morning radio checks, weather reports, and scanning the forest for smoke. The blood still appeared every night, and I still cleaned it every morning. The voices still called my name after dark, and I still stayed
inside, but I was getting used to it all, treating it like just another part of the job. Wednesday afternoon was perfectly clear.
Not a cloud in the sky, temperature in the mid-70s, barely any wind. I was updating my logbook when I heard it. Thunder, deep rolling thunder that seemed to go on forever, echoing through the forest like it was coming from all directions at once. I looked up from my logbook and started toward the windows to see what was causing it. The sky was still completely clear, bright blue, without even a wisp of cloud anywhere. But the thunder kept rolling, one long continuous rumble that made the tower vibrate slightly. That's when I remembered the 4th rule. If you hear thunder during clear weather, don't look outside until it stops. I froze halfway to the window and backed away, moving to the center of the cabin. The thunder continued for what felt like forever. A low rumbling that seemed to come from the earth itself rather than the sky. I sat on my bed and waited, checking my watch every few minutes. The sound went on for over an hour, never stopping, never changing pitch. It was hypnotic in a way, and I found myself wanting to look outside to see what could possibly be making that noise. But I forced myself to stay put, remembering how well the evacuation rule had worked during the storm. Finally, around 3:30, the thunder stopped as suddenly as it had started. The forest went completely quiet for a few seconds. Then, gradually, the normal sounds returned. Birds chirping, wind in the trees, the usual background noise of the wilderness. I waited another 10 minutes before moving to the windows, but everything looked normal. Clear sky, green forest, nothing out of place. The same thing happened Friday afternoon. Clear skies, perfect weather, then that same rolling thunder that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. This time I didn't even hesitate. I moved to the center of the cabin and waited it out. The sound lasted about 45 minutes, then stopped just as abruptly as before. Saturday brought another episode, this one lasting nearly 2 hours. I used the time to organize my supplies and update my
logbook, trying to ignore the constant rumbling that made my teeth ache.
When it finally stopped, I realized I was getting better at following the rules without questioning them. Whatever was causing that thunder during clear weather, I didn't want to see it. The fourth occurrence happened on Sunday, right in the
middle of my evening radio check with Grace. I was giving her the weather report when the thunder started up again.
She asked if I was experiencing a storm since she could hear the rumbling through the radio. I told her it was just some distant thunder, nothing to worry about. She seemed satisfied with that explanation, and we finished the check-in normally. I spent the next hour and a half sitting in the center of the cabin, listening to that impossible thunder roll across a perfectly clear evening sky. When it finally ended, I made myself a simple dinner and tried not to think about what I might
have seen if I'd looked outside during any of those episodes.
The rules were keeping me safe. That much was clear. Whatever was happening in this forest, the previous lookouts had figured out how to survive it and had been kind enough to write it down. I was starting to understand that my job wasn't just watching for fires. It was learning to coexist with something that didn't follow normal rules. I'd been at Tower 7 for 4 weeks when I spotted the first fire. It was Tuesday night around 11:30 and I was doing my final check of the forest before bed. The voices had been calling my name for about 3 hours already, same as every night, but I'd gotten used to tuning them out while I worked. That's when I saw the orange glow through the trees, maybe 2 tantismi northeast of my position. At first, I thought it might be a campfire, but it was too big and too bright. I grabbed my binoculars and focused on the area, definitely flames, and they were spreading. I pulled out my map and calculated the coordinates, then reached for the
radio, Grace answered on the second call. Tower 7 to dispatch. I've got a fire situation, I said, keeping my voice steady.
Coordinates are approximately 47 dig 12 minutes north, 191 dig 38 minutes west. Flames visible appears to be spreading. Copy that, Tower 7. Can you estimate the size? I looked through the binoculars again. The fire seemed to be moving in a weird pattern, not like any wildfire I'd seen before.
It jumped around instead of spreading in a normal line. Hard to tell from this distance, but maybe 3 to 4 acres. The spread pattern looks unusual, though. Unusual how? I watched the flames dance between the trees. They seemed to move independently.
Like separate fires instead of one big one. It's not spreading in a normal pattern. Looks more like multiple ignition points. Roger. We'll send a crew out to investigate. Any idea what might have caused it? I checked my notes. No lightning activity today. No controlled burns scheduled in that sector according to my briefings. Confirmed. No authorized burns in your area. Crews en route. ETA about 45 minutes. Keep monitoring and report any changes. Will do. I hung up the radio and went back to watching the fire. The flames kept moving in that strange pattern, appearing in one spot, then jumping to another area 50 yards away. It didn't make sense. Fires don't behave like that unless there's something really weird going on with the wind, and the air was completely still tonight. The voices outside kept calling my name, but I ignored them and focused on the fire. By the time the emergency crew arrived, the flames had spread to maybe 6 or 7 different locations, all disconnected from each other. I radioed the updated coordinates to Grace, who passed them along to the team. I stayed up until almost 3 in the morning watching through my binoculars as the crew worked. Their lights moved through the forest like fireflies, and I could see them setting up equipment. The actual flames died down pretty quickly once they got there, but they stayed on site for hours. Wednesday morning, Grace called me during my regular check-in. Tower 7, we got the report back from last night's fire. What did they find? That's the weird part. There was definitely evidence of fire, burned vegetation, charred ground, but the burn pattern. She paused. The crew chief said he's never seen anything like it. Multiple ignition points with no connecting burn lines, no evidence of accelerants or human activity. I looked out toward the area where I had seen the flames. In daylight, I couldn't see any smoke or obvious damage from this distance. So, what caused it? Unknown. But here's what's got everyone puzzled. The burned areas form a perfect circle. 7 separate burn spots, all exactly the same size, arranged in a ring about 200 feet across. That gave me chills. Natural fires don't burn in circles. No, they don't. The crew chief wants to know if you've seen any other unusual fire activity in your sector. I thought about it. Nothing like that. This was the first fire I've spotted since I got here. Okay. Well, keep your eyes open. And Morrison. Yeah, if you see any more fires like that one, don't try to get a closer look. Just radio in the coordinates and let the crews
handle it. Some of the fires we've been seeing in this region lately, they're not what they seem. What do you mean? Just follow protocol, report and observe from a distance. That's an order?
The line went quiet for a few seconds, then Grace signed off. I spent the rest of Wednesday scanning the forest, but everything looked normal. No smoke, no unusual activity, just trees and more trees. Thursday passed without incident. Same routine. Morning radio check, weather reports, scanning for smoke. The blood still showed up every morning, and I cleaned it like always. The voices still called my name after dark, but no more fires. Friday morning started my 5th week at the tower. I was getting used to the routine by then. Wake up, clean whatever blood had appeared overnight. Make coffee, do the radio check. It was becoming almost normal, which probably should have worried me more than it did. That afternoon around 2, I was updating my logbook when I noticed something moving in the trees below. I grabbed my binoculars and focused on the spot. There was a man standing among the trees, maybe 50 yards from the base of the tower. He was just standing there, completely still, looking up at me. I couldn't make out his face clearly because of the shadows, but I could tell he was tall and wearing dark clothes. I watched him for about 10 minutes. He didn't move at all, didn't shift his weight, didn't look around, didn't do anything except stare up at the observation deck. It was like looking at a statue. I tried calling down to him. "Hey, you okay down there?" No response. He just kept staring. I thought about the rules, specifically the one about not making contact with people in the forest. But this guy was just standing there, and it was broad daylight. Maybe he was lost or hurt. "Do you need help?" I shouted louder. Still nothing. He didn't even acknowledge that I was talking to him. I kept watching through the binoculars, trying to get a better look at his face. But every time I thought I was about to make out his features, the shadows seemed to shift and obscure them again. His clothes looked dark. Maybe a black jacket or coat, but I couldn't tell much else. After about an hour, I decided to radio Grace and ask if there were any other personnel in my area. But when I reached for the radio, something made me stop. The guy was still down there, still staring up at me. Something about the way he stood, perfectly motionless, like he wasn't even breathing, made my skin crawl. I decided to just keep watching instead. 3 came and went. The man hadn't moved an inch. I started timing him, checking my watch every few minutes. 5 minutes of absolute stillness, 10 minutes, 15. No human being stands that still for that long, without at least shifting their weight or adjusting their position. At 4, I did my afternoon weather check with Grace. I thought about mentioning the guy in the trees, but something held me back. Maybe it was the memory of her warning about the fires. Some of the fires we've been seeing aren't what they seem. Maybe some of the people weren't what they seemed either. I kept watching him through the rest of the afternoon. 5, 6, and 7, he never moved, never looked away from the tower, never showed any sign that he was a living person instead of some kind of mannequin someone had placed in the forest. As the sun started to set, I realized I'd been watching this guy for over 5 hours. My neck was getting stiff from holding the binoculars, and my eyes were starting to water. But I couldn't look away. There was something hypnotic about his absolute stillness. The shadows got longer as the sun dropped toward the horizon. Soon it would be dark and the voices would start calling my name like they did every night. I wondered if the man would still be there when that happened. I wondered if he was connected to the voices somehow. At 8:15, just as the first voice started calling from the north side of the tower, I looked through the binoculars one more time. The spot where the man had been standing was empty. He was gone, like he'd never been there at all. I scanned the entire area with the binoculars, looking for any sign of movement or where he might have gone. Nothing. The forest looked exactly the same as it had every other day, except now I knew someone, or something, had been watching me for over 6 hours without moving a muscle. The voices kept calling my name from the darkness below. But I stayed away from the windows and didn't look outside. I'd learned that lesson already. Whatever was happening in this forest, the rules were the only thing keeping me safe. I'd been at Tower 7 for 5 weeks when things started getting really bad. The 6th week hit me like a freight train. Everything I'd been dealing with suddenly cranked up to 11. Monday morning, I woke up and found blood everywhere, not just the usual drops on the windows or streaks on the walls. This time, it covered half the floor, pulled around the radio equipment, and dripped from the ceiling in steady streams. I went through 2 entire bottles of bleach that morning, scrubbing until my hands were raw. The metallic smell was so strong I had to open all the windows just to breathe. Tuesday was worse. Blood had soaked into my sleeping bag overnight, turning the fabric dark red and stiff. I found it smeared across every window, thick enough that I couldn't see outside until I cleaned it off. The radio crackled with static during my morning check-in with Grace, cutting out 3 times before I could complete my weather report. Tower 7, you're breaking up. Grace's voice came through choppy and distant. Copy that, dispatch. Equipment's been acting up. Do you need maintenance support? I looked at the blood-stained radio equipment I just finished cleaning. Negative. Should be fine. But it wasn't fine. Wednesday afternoon, the radio died completely during clear weather. No static, no background hum, just dead silence. I packed my emergency gear and hiked to the maintenance cabin, following the same route I'd taken during the storm. The backup. Radio worked, but barely. Grace's voice came through weak and broken. Tower 7. Where you been? Radio failure. At backup location. Copy. Return when? Signal clear. I spent 3 hours in that windowless cabin before the tower radio came back online. Thursday it happened again. Friday, twice. By the weekend, I was hiking to the backup cabin almost daily. Sometimes multiple times when the radio would work for an hour, then cut out again. The voices got louder too. What started as distant calls of my name became a constant chorus that seemed to come from every direction at once. They'd begin earlier each night, 7:30, then 7, then 6:30. By Saturday, they were calling my name during daylight hours, echoing through the trees while I tried to do my afternoon weather checks. The thunder was the worst part. Every single day that week, clear skies would suddenly fill with deep, rolling rumbles that made the tower shake. It lasted longer each time. 2 hours Monday, 3 hours Tuesday, 4 hours Wednesday. I'd retreat to the center of the cabin and wait it out, checking my watch every few minutes and trying not to think about what might happen if I looked outside. Thursday afternoon, I spotted the figure again. Same dark clothes, same motionless stance, but this time it stood only 30 yards from the tower base. I watched through binoculars for 20 minutes before it vanished without warning. Friday, it appeared, twice. Once at dawn near the tree-ine, once
at sunset closer to the tower. Saturday, I saw it 4 different times in 4 different locations. Always staring up at me, always perfectly still.
By Sunday, I understood what the handwritten rules really were, not jokes or pranks from bored lookouts. Survival instructions. Someone had been here before me, dealt with the same things and lived long enough to write down what worked. Blood cleaning, staying inside after dark, evacuating during radio failures, avoiding windows during clear weather thunder, reporting fires without investigating, not making contact with people in the forest. Every rule had kept me alive. The 7th week started quietly. Monday and Tuesday felt almost normal. Just the usual blood drops, voices calling for a few hours each night. One radio failure that lasted 30 minutes. I started thinking maybe the worst was over. I was wrong. Wednesday morning, I woke up to find blood covering everything, not just spots or streaks. The entire cabin interior looked like someone had painted it red. Blood dripped from the ceiling, pulled on the floor, coated the windows so thick I couldn't see outside. It covered the radio equipment, soaked into my bedding, and ran down the walls in steady streams. The metallic smell was overwhelming. I started cleaning immediately, working section by section with bleach and paper towels. It took 4 hours to get through it all. My hands were cracked and bleeding from the chemicals by the time I finished.
That's when the voices started. It was 10 in the morning. They'd never called during daylight before, but there they were. Multiple voices shouting my name from every direction, not the usual flat, emotionless tone. These sounded urgent, almost
angry. They overlapped and echoed until I couldn't tell how many there were or where they were coming from. I tried the radio for my morning check-in. Dead silence, not even static. The power light was on, but nothing else worked. I packed my emergency gear and headed for the ladder, but stopped halfway down when I heard the voices getting louder. They seemed to be moving closer to the tower, calling my name in rapid succession like they were trying to surround me. I climbed back up and tried the radio again. Still nothing. The voices continued for another hour before stopping abruptly. At 11 hours, the radio crackled back to life at 11:15, Tower 7. This is dispatch, please respond. Dispatch, Tower 7 had equipment failure. Copy that. Everything operational now. I looked at the blood-stained equipment I'd spent the morning cleaning. Affirmative, but it wasn't. The radio died again at noon, came back at 1, died at 2. Each time I'd pack my gear to evacuate, and each time the voices would start up before I could reach the ground. They seemed to know when I was trying to leave. Thursday brought thunder during perfectly clear skies. It started at 8 in the morning and didn't stop. Deep, continuous rumbling that made the windows rattle and the floor vibrate under my feet. I positioned myself in the center of the cabin and waited, but it just kept going. 9 hours of constant thunder under blue skies with not a cloud in sight. The voices joined in around noon, calling my name between the thunder rolls. The radio was completely dead, no power light, no static, nothing. I couldn't evacuate because of the voices, couldn't look outside because of the thunder, couldn't call for help because the radio was down. At 5 in the afternoon, I spotted flames through the south window, 3 separate fires burning in different locations, each one spreading in that same impossible pattern I'd seen before, jumping between trees instead of spreading normally. I tried the radio but got nothing. The flames grew larger while the thunder continued, and the voices called my name from the darkness below. Then I saw the figure. It stood directly beneath the tower, closer than it had ever been before, maybe 20 ft from the base, staring straight up at me through the windows. Even with the blood covering the glass, I could see its dark outline perfectly still against the forest floor. The thunder stopped. The voices went silent. The flames disappeared, but the figure remained, looking up at me with that same motionless intensity I'd seen before. The radio stayed dead, and blood continued dripping from the ceiling onto the equipment below. I followed every rule exactly as everything started happening at once. The blood was everywhere again. Thick pools covering half the floor, dripping steadily from the ceiling onto my radio equipment. I grabbed the bleach and paper towels, working fast to clean it up before it got worse. My hands were already raw from all the cleaning I'd been doing, but I couldn't let the blood sit there. The thunder started while I was scrubbing the floor, deep rolling sounds that made the whole tower shake. Even though I could see clear blue sky through the windows, I knew better than to look outside during clear weather thunder. That was rule number 4. I positioned myself in the center of the cabin and kept cleaning, trying to ignore how the windows rattled with each rumble. Then the voices started calling my name. Not just the usual nighttime chorus, but loud, urgent shouts that seemed to come from everywhere at once. They overlapped and echoed, getting louder by the minute. I finished cleaning the last bloodstain and tried the radio, but the power light was dead. No static, no hum, nothing. I packed my emergency gear, water bottles, energy bars, flashlight, first aid kit. The voices were getting so loud now they seemed to be coming from inside the tower itself, bouncing off the walls. I started toward the ladder, but something made me stop. Through the blood-streaked window I could see the figure standing directly below the tower, maybe 20 ft from the base, closer than it had ever been before. The thing just stood there perfectly still, staring up at me. I couldn't make out any
features through the blood on the glass, but I could feel it watching.
The voices kept shouting my name, and now I heard something else. Metal creaking, slow, deliberate sounds like someone putting weight on the ladder rungs. I backed away from the window and grabbed more cleaning supplies. The blood was appearing, faster than I could clean it, dripping from the ceiling in steady streams. But I kept scrubbing, following the rules. Clean the blood. Don't look outside during thunder. The metal creaking got louder, more rhythmic. Something was definitely climbing the tower structure. My hands shook as I worked, but I didn't stop cleaning. The voices were so loud now I could barely think. They seemed to be coming from the walls themselves, from the floor, from the ceiling. The thunder rolled on, making everything vibrate. Through it all, that steady creaking of metal underweight. I finished the last section of floor and looked around for more blood to clean. The voices suddenly got even louder, if that was possible.
Angry now, urgent. The creaking was maybe halfway up the tower. I could hear each individual step on the ladder rungs. Then I spotted the fires through the south window. 3 separate blazes burning in that impossible pattern I'd seen before.
Flames jumping between trees instead of spreading normally. They were growing fast, too fast. The radio was still dead, and I couldn't call for help. The figure was climbing toward me, the voices were screaming my name, and the forest was burning in ways that made no sense. I grabbed my emergency pack and headed for the ladder again. The voices got even louder as I approached the window, but I had to try. The creaking was getting closer, maybe 3/4 of the way up now. I couldn't see what was climbing, but I could hear it clearly over the thunder and voices. Just as I reached for the ladder, the radio crackled to life. Static filled the cabin. Then Grace's voice came through weak and broken. "Tower 7, this is dispatch. Do you copy?" I lunged for the radio. "Grace, this is Tower 7. I've got multiple fires coordinates." I rattled off the location of the flames I could see. Emergency crews needed immediately. "Copy that, Tower 7. Crews are already en route to your sector. ETA 15 minutes. The moment she said that, everything stopped. The thunder cut off mid-roll. The voices went silent, so suddenly my ears rang. The creaking on the ladder stopped. I looked toward the south window. The fires were gone, just gone like they'd never been there. I moved to the north window and peered down through the blood streaks. The figure had vanished. No sign of it anywhere around the tower base. The forest looked completely normal, like nothing had happened. No smoke, no flames, no mysterious climber on my ladder. The radio crackled again. "Tower 7 crews are reporting no fire activity in your sector. Can you confirm your coordinates?" I stared out at the empty forest, my hands still shaking from the bleach and adrenaline. Everything was quiet now except for the normal sounds of wind in the trees.